Hey everyone, this is Aaron Pierce, and you're watching Day 2 of Steiger's Sexuality in the Secular Age event. If you have not seen Day 1, make sure you check that out here. Today we have two special guests, Ted Shimer and Rachel Gardner, as we talk about bringing the love and truth of Jesus to a generation that has been destroyed by pornography and casual sex. It's an amazing conversation, so make sure you watch all the way to the end, where we have a Q&A section with Rachel and Tim. And also, you're going to learn more about how you can get connected to Steiger as we mobilize followers of Jesus to reach young people who would not walk into a church. If you want to learn more about Steiger, check out this video or go to steiger.org. One last thing, this event was recorded live with translation, so you'll notice some cuts that take place throughout the video because we wanted to make it easier for you to view it.
Hello people, how are you all today? So good to have you all back with us.
Hello, hello, hello. I hope you all have a chance to hear all of us and see everybody so you can list and see there are people from so many different countries.
So I'm with Angela Kachenko all the way from Ukraine today. So good we can do this together, Angela.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be with everyone on this call. And I'm just anticipating. Yesterday was such a great day.
Yeah, that's right. We have had over 2,500 people sign up for this event from 79 different countries. Well, this is the Sexuality in the Secular Age of online event, and it is run by our mission Steiger. My name is Luke, and I am the European director for Steiger. And Angela started Steiger in the Russian-speaking world, and it's spread all over. Okay, so today we have Rachel Gardner and Ted Shimer with us. Rachel, great to have you.
Thank you. It's amazing to be here.
You're in the UK right now, right?
I'm in the north of England and it's cold and dark.
And Ted, where are you talking from today?
I'm speaking from the U.S., from Arkansas, which is right above Texas.
Great. Well, Rachel has been working with young people, youth workers, church leaders for 2 decades. She's written several books, but her latest one is called The Sex Thing, reimagining conversations with young people about sex. And she really engages with how to present a biblical sexual ethic. So we're going to be hearing from her. I'm excited to hear her thoughts on this topic. And Ted is the founder of The Freedom Fight. It's an online porn addiction recovery program. And Ted has been mentoring men since 1991 in student ministry. He's helped a lot of people recover from the bondage of pornography. And so we want to hear some thoughts and tips from Ted today. So guys, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to jump straight in with our questions. And let's start right at the core of what we're talking about. You know, I shared a bit at the beginning how we're really trying to engage with a secular culture that doesn't come to people that don't come to the church. And one of the key things is there's a different mindset, right? There's a different way of seeing the world between us as followers of Jesus and the guys outside. So Rachel, could you talk to us a bit about that difference when it comes to our view of sex and romantic relationships? How do people who don't follow Jesus see that? And what's the difference from that biblical perspective on sex and romantic relationships?
I don't think that our views inside the church, Luke, are all that different sometimes to secular culture. I think the difference is that we have a deep hunger to put something different at the center of our lives. And that's why I think it's so important that we talk about sex for us, ourselves too, as well as for the mission. That's really important. But if I think about how the culture around me in the north of England, the young people that I work with, if I think about how they view relationships and sex, it's complicated, messed up, they're disappointed, full of social anxiety, desperate to make themselves happy, and they think that falling in love, having sexual experiences, those are the key.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's not just, you can't just isolate the sex thing, as you call it. There's so much more going on behind in terms of how people are feeling, right? Ted, do you want to add something about that? How do you see this, the difference between a Christian perspective and how a lot of our culture today is seeing sex?
Yes, and I would agree with Angela that in some cases it's not much different in the church than outside the church, because that's the case with pornography consumption. Sex was given as a gift to be shared and enjoyed within marriage, but pornography has made it a consumer mentality. So that's one of the reasons we've seen an explosion in the hookup culture, as we've seen with pornography exploding since the iPhone. And so when somebody has grown up watching porn and masturbating since they were 12, and then they get into a relationship in their 20s, sex is all about them. And so it just changes their whole perspective.
What about this aspect I shared a little bit about in our intro? How one of the ideas that seems common today is that love is just a passing feeling. And it seems like we've forgotten how to really connect, and so we keep moving from one relationship to the other. Do you feel like that relates to, does that affect the way we understand romantic relationships and sex?
I think in culture, we're still looking for the great love. But the difference is that in culture now, we're told that it's deeply connecting with ourselves. That's the greatest love. So I would say that even in the stories, the lyrics, the films that present a story of sacrificial love, it's still about me connecting ultimately with myself. And so I think it's not always obvious for young people that actually they're looking for the wrong kind of love, because it feels like they want sacrificial, faithful love. They just don't realize it's not about themselves at the center of their world. It's about a different kind of love.
Well, and it's interesting that pornography builds on that self-centeredness related to sex, because pornography makes a person engage in self-sex, but it also trains a person to want new and different sexual partners. And so again, that's why pornography is so destructive to relationships, because when somebody's grown up since 13, training their mind to want new and different sexual partners, it's difficult for them to be satisfied with one when they do enter into that relationship.
I mean, God made us as bodies, minds, souls, the whole lot, didn't he? And when we talk about sex, we also need to talk about young people's mental and emotional well-being. And I'm so heartbroken that most of the teenagers I work with have been really hurt by family relationships, romantic relationships by the age of 14, 15, 16. And they're often afraid of in person to person, deeply emotional, intimate relationship. So online sex, virtual reality sex feels safer. But Ted is right in saying it opens up a devastating landscape for deep destruction.
Yeah, I want to go even further and ask the question. Maybe I can ask you, Ted, because we can see the growth of not only pornography, but also human trafficking, sexual violence. Do you think there is a connection in between being addicted to pornography and then maybe stepping further to, even these horrible things?
Yeah, absolutely. An addiction to porn leads to not just wanting more, but different. And it's interesting, the Apostle Paul talked about this in the book of Ephesians. His description of what some of the believers in Ephesus were doing, he said they're greedy to practice every kind of impurity. And that's what makes pornography scary. When somebody starts chasing the sexual high that comes from that, they find themselves doing things or seeing things they never thought they would do or see. Paul said they're greedy to practice every kind of impurity. Locally, we had a 16-year-old boy just recently charged with child pornography.
I think as well, there's an element in which like the feminist ideology has said to girls, girls, boys are going to watch porn. So actually take that on and feel empowered by fulfilling the sexual fantasies played out in pornography, film, gaming, all of it. So I hate, for example, Cardi B's, like the video WAP, because it's saying to young girls, this is what makes you powerful. Be the porn star, it makes you powerful. And it's so normalized that the young people I spend time with here in England think there's nothing dangerous, nothing wrong, nothing cynical, nothing hurtful about pornography and just getting everything out.
Do you think, Rachel, often when we talk about pornography, we talk about it as a guy thing, a guy problem. But I mean, you've pointed to one aspect that how it affects girls. But I mean, what I'm hearing is, it's a problem almost the same for girls nowadays as well. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's really important that we don't say it's just men and boys that watch porn. And I think it's much harder for girls and women, particularly in church, to talk about the porn that they watch. Because there's already an expectation that men and boys are sexual beings, but often churches forget to remind girls and women, you're created as a sexual being too. And I think just like for boys, girls and women watch porn for very complicated reasons. But overwhelmingly, the teenage girls that I work with and mentor are watching porn because they want to know what to do. And I'm a woman in her 40s, and I love seeing girls and women empowered into all that God's called them to be. And I'm eager for the church to speak out against the sexualization of girls through pornography. I mean, I'd like to ask Ted this as well, draw you in on this one, Ted, because I think it can be very difficult for boys and girls to talk about porn habits, particularly in church, because it's so linked in with, it could lead to escalating, dehumanizing sexual behavior. But really, they're just watching it because they want to get off. They don't want to be having sex with a partner outside of marriage, maybe, or they want to know what's expected of them. And so it can be so how do we handle that pastorally? I find that quite difficult.
Well, the shame is what keeps people in the dark and what keeps the church from speaking on this topic. There's shame that comes with any addiction, but particularly for the Christian who struggles with a sex or a porn addiction. And even more if you're a woman that struggles, a Christian woman. And so the enemy is keeping so many people in the shadows in this sin. And so helping to educate the church about this topic is critical.
That's why we're doing this event, of course, because this whole question of sexuality, not only pornography, but like you said, Rachel, like sexuality, who am I? Like, what is okay? What is not okay? Is it okay that I feel this way? It needs to be brought to light.
Well,
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I don't think the church recognizes the destructive impact of pornography on marriages, on a person's spiritual life, service in the church, on godly parenting. There's a lot of research that shows that porn is waging war in each of those areas.
I would say, sorry, Teddy.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. But I would say, as missionaries to global youth culture, there's actually incredible missional opportunity here. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about leading at such a time as this, where the deep question that is everywhere in global youth culture is about intimacy and relationship. And so actually, I really enjoy getting involved in conversations that feel so messy. I'm not surprised by them. And although I'm often heartbroken at the story of the young adults and the pain and their struggle, that breaks my heart, I'm not afraid. And I think that's why I'm so proud of this call today, because genuinely, there are no other human beings on the planet that have the ultimate gift, the answer that everyone's craving for. But this is my challenge to you, and it's my challenge to me. We don't start the mission by talking about sex and a biblical sexual ethic. That's not where we start. Erwin McManus, in his book, The Genius of Jesus, said, if you hang around with Picasso, there's no guarantee you'll become an amazing artist. If you hang around with Beyonce, there's no guarantee you'll become an amazing singer. But if you hang around with Jesus, you will grow into the most extraordinary human being. And the fruit of that obedience and the fruit of the presence of Jesus will mean you will look radical in your relationships. And that is where the mission is.
Yeah, this is so powerful.
I agree with Rachel, that addressing this issue is an opportunity for evangelism and discipleship. Porn users are less sexually satisfied. Research shows they're more depressed and lonely. It's an example of John 10:10. Thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus says, I came that you may have life and have it to the full. Porn promises sexual satisfaction. We can point to a lot of places where it brings death and disappointment. And yet, when we follow Jesus, we get to have an abundance of life. Married couples have more and better sex, research shows. And one of the impacts of pornography is the epidemic level of porn-induced erectile dysfunction among 20 and 30-year-olds. I've used that topic in witnessing to people to point that the Bible's wisdom leads to life, because the porn-induced erectile dysfunction is at epidemic levels.
Strong way to convince the guys there. That's a strong argument.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Angela, you had a question, I think.
Rachel, maybe you could share with us some of your practices, some of your questions, ideas on how to actually talk to non-believers who are engaged, who are buying to the casual sex, how to talk to them about Jesus.
So for me up here, it's all about building relationships and building communities of holiness. And you know what? In the Bible, God said the man who was after his heart was King David, someone who messed up sexually when he knew God.
Quando ele já conhecia a Deus.
Right.
And what they get to see is other people like them taking off the mask, dialing down the banter. Does the word banter translate?
Pamela did a good
tricky.
job.
And being genuinely real about what's really behind their needs. There are so many lies, there are so many myths, there's so much pretense in youth culture, but there's actually really brokenness underneath. And when young people realize there's a place that they can bring that and be real about that, they're willing to open up to a God that maybe can sort out the mess.
That's awesome. I love your heart, Rachel. Ted, I'm wondering I've noticed that pornography's also been more and more talked about in the secular context. There's TED Talks, etc. about this. So do you find that non-Christians also looking for help in your work in helping people be free from pornography? Are there a lot of non-Christians also looking for help like that?
A small number that have faced a crisis because of their sex addiction. More voices are noticing the dangers, but by and large, it's a pornified world.
I'm wondering, when it comes to sharing with non-believers, one of the challenges I think we have as Christians is, at least the way I perceive it, is there's a lack of confidence in the biblical perspective on sex and on these things. I don't know if you find this, Rachel, but sometimes I feel maybe when, teens find this a bit harder, but I think young adults as well, they don't talk so much about this topic with their non-believing friends because they don't have confidence in that we have a beautiful view of sexuality,
I think sometimes it's because we think that evangelism is convincing everybody that we're right, rather than witnessing to the difference that Jesus makes. And I think we've forgotten the power of living a radical, authentic life just among our friends. But I think also, Luke, the other thing that is difficult for us is that maybe so many of us did the right thing when it came to sex, but for the wrong reasons. So maybe we didn't have sex before we were married. Maybe we've not got a pornography habit, but maybe it's because we're afraid of angering God rather than because we're so captivated by the power of a radically holy life.
That's powerful.
As a young adult, I had really addictive behavior around masturbation. I wasn't using pornography, but I had really addictive masturbation habit. So anybody looking at me would have said, she's got a great biblical sexual ethic. But when I realized that God's grace was for me too, that he loved me, not because I was being a good girl, but because he loved me, then I could deal with it. I could talk to some older women in church. They were amazing. And I began to find freedom.
Não, vai lá.
although I have a conservative biblical sexual ethic, what I want to talk to young people about is outrageous grace.
Wow. Well, let me use that as a like to shift into a different gear now, because we've talked a lot about the challenges of all this, the effects of it, but obviously grace, right? How can we find grace? How can we be free if we're struggling in any aspect in all of this? So Ted, this is something you've put a lot of your work and ministry into, helping people be free from pornography. What are some of the key points that you could give us that you see as really important in being free from addiction to pornography and other related sexual addictions?
Well, the first step, James 5:16 says that confession is what leads to healing. And so the first step is walking into the light, sharing with somebody that you have a struggle. When the Apostle Paul addressed this issue with the Ephesian believers in Ephesians 4:17 through 27, he addressed holiness, renewing the mind, which renewing the mind is important with a lot of the new brain science we've learned in the last decade. People have built strong neurological pathways in their mind with pornography. It's not enough just to repress the old pathway. And the topic of grace that Rachel mentioned earlier is huge in addressing shame. Helping people realize the identity that they can have in Christ instead of living out of a shame identity. But it's so critical that we address the roots of the issue instead of just the symptoms. Most people don't realize they've been using pornography as a coping mechanism, very powerful at numbing and medicating negative emotions. Addiction experts tell us when we start using an addictive substance like porn or drugs, that's when the addiction goes to a whole new level of depth, because it happens at a subconscious level. So then the next time I'm stressed or anxious, this huge urge to use porn comes out of nowhere. A lot of people think it hits them out of nowhere, but they don't realize they've been using porn to medicate their emotions. And so often, it's either a trauma or a shame identity that is feeding those negative emotions that are even below the surface. And so our program, which is free, it systematically walks through the roots that Paul addressed in Ephesians 4. And it's really proven to be powerful discipleship, Luke, as you've mentioned earlier. People aren't just finding freedom, but a new life in Christ that is powerful. And this is one of the things we try to help churches realize. This isn't just a problem, but it's an opportunity.
Yeah, this is actually related to my next question to you, Ted, because we definitely can see that it influences our society and it affects our churches and missions, right? So how would you say, how does this affect the church? And what would you suggest? What practices, what should the church do to address this issue?
Well, it's definitely a tool of spiritual warfare the enemy is using. It's destroying marriages in the church.
Está destruindo casamentos na igreja.
There's a direct correlation between porn use and the service in the church. It decreases. And there's a direct correlation between a person's spiritual life related to their porn use. 1 Peter 2:11 says, fleshly lust wages war against the soul. And so to answer the question, I think we have to educate the church on the impact that porn is having, helping spiritual leaders see the opportunity for deep discipleship by addressing the issue. When Paul addressed this issue, he didn't give Christian cliche answers, but he addressed the roots. And again, the opportunity for growth, for even see evangelism taking place is incredible.
Yeah. Rachel, you've also worked quite a bit in churches and helping people think through how to address these issues, how to bring the topic up in the church. What do you think are some of the key things us as churches need to do differently or learn or grow in when it comes to talking about sex with young people and the young adults too?
Thanks, Luke. Somebody posed a really great question, which I'm going to use to answer your question. Someone said, how can you make sure grace isn't enablement and accountability isn't powerless? Mercy and grace are God's gifts. It's God's grace that we're talking about, not ours in many ways. And if you imagine a tree, like a bit of a tree, you've got the trunk of the tree and then you've got the branches. Holiness, right living, righteousness, following the biblical sexual ethic, that's not the trunk, that's the branches. The trunk is obedience to Jesus. And so how I talk to young people about sex, how can I be obedient to Jesus in this? Where is this damaging my obedience to Jesus, my connection to Jesus? And as disciplers of global youth culture, we're playing the long game. It might take a long time for a young person to really walk in obedience and us begin to see the fruit in their lives. We're in good company because Jesus had exactly the same issues with his disciples. So we extend grace because we want to keep bringing people back to how are you being obedient to Jesus? He loves you. He's got freedom and forgiveness. Keep that at the center. And the grace is, I think we need to stop saying to young people, if you masturbate, if you watch porn, if you have sex, that's it, you're out. Mm-hmm. Discipleship is, let's come back to the most important thing. How are you being obedient to Jesus? And over time, what happens in us is that we get to the point where we just don't want to sin anymore. And that's discipleship, isn't it? It's a long journey. Mm-hmm. So I think our role as missionaries to global youth culture is to get them curious about living radically different. And it might take a long time before they choose that for themselves.
That is so helpful, Rachel. Thank you. And like you said, it's really relevant to a lot of what our guys are doing out there. I love what you've both brought, because you've brought both practical points, like how can we deal with this? How can we work through these different things? But just full of Jesus and full of grace as well, in terms of the hope that we have in him. And, I think like for us as a mission, that's really important. I mean, Ted, I remember, I can't remember if I read or watched something from you somewhere, but you realized... you were saying that you realized that pornography was a real problem when you started asking a question in your recruiting for your student ministry. And as you started asking if people struggled in the area of pornography, etc., that just kept coming up. And we found the same thing as a mission, asking both our recruits and our teams who's struggling with stuff. And it is just devastating how common it is everywhere. But I love the grace that you guys are bringing in, that we can work through this. We can find in Jesus the transformation.
One practical thing that was really helpful for us, and I think could be helpful to share, is when addressing it in a ministry or a church, making it for everybody. Hey, this is such a big issue. We all need to be equipped. Yeah. Our program is a 6-month program, but we've created a 30-day challenge kind of as a first step. But that's been helpful to allow churches, and hey, this is an equipping for all of us to go through. Because when it's only, hey, if you've got a sex addiction or a problem, come to this small group, no one's going to show up.
Right.
But a lot of churches miss that. And they wonder why nobody shows up to their group.
Well, we're going to get into some more practical points in the Q&A, I think. But first, we're going to take a break. So we got a 10-minute break now. Now, everybody pay attention. Don't leave the Zoom call. You can turn your camera and mute yourself. Well, you're already muted. You can turn your camera off if you want. But don't log off because it's hard to get back in. Now, after the break, the translation, the main translation is going to change. We're going to have Spanish. So if you're listening to Portuguese, you will need to select Portuguese on the interpretation button. Okay, I think that's all the announcements before the break. Thank you for all the questions you guys have been posting. I've seen it going crazy in the chat. We will select some of those and we'll be working through them after this break. All right, see you guys in 10 minutes. Changed, as you can see. So if you need Portuguese translation, click on the interpretation button and choose Portuguese. All right, are you guys there? Give me a woot woot in the chat if you're there. Seems like there's a good number of people there. That's good. I'm glad you guys are there.
Ok, ya me di cuenta que hay varias personas respondiendo. Me encanta saber que están ahí conmigo.
All right, this is it. We're going to have some questions now from the audience.
Before I jump into the question, number one, I really quickly want to share my own feedback. I really was so touched by both of you, Ted and Rachel. And again, like, you know, like Jesus said, I'm going to give you the water that will become a well on the inside of you, right? So the answer to all of the questions and pornography and LGBT and others, the answer is the same. It's intimacy with Jesus, right? It's discovering this well that's on the inside of us that brings the satisfaction. Okay, and I'm jumping into the questions, but there are so many of them from all over the world. So we'll try to, you know, combine them into like this very interesting ones. And the question that dominates over the rest of the questions is about masturbation. And I'll probably start with this one because it's the hard one. So how should the young people who lead ministries in the church be dealt with when they cannot triumph over their own sexual sin? Yeah, Rachel, maybe you can start, and then Ted.
I warn you, I'm going to be controversial. I'm not Jesus, and if you don't agree with what I say, that's absolutely fine. The Bible lists every different kind of sexual activity. It never lists solo sex. So I think calling masturbation per se a sin is an argument from silence. There's a very dangerous toxic link between pornography and masturbation, between sexual fantasy and masturbation. But most of us began masturbating in our teenage years because we were responding to overwhelming sexual urges. We were not actively seeking to be disobedient to Jesus. So I don't think it helps to say to young Christian people, all masturbation in itself is a sin. I think it helps to talk with young people about what sexual responses it's developing within us. And it's a way of helping young people understand their sexual urges and to understand that just because they have been, they've got sexual stimuli, they don't have to act on it now or ever. Those are really important things to learn. And if we only say to them, it's a sin anyway, they never ever can distinguish and identify and learn developing patterns and what they want to do and how they can do it differently. It's just too much of shame. In my 20s, my masturbation habit did become a sinful habit in my life, but it didn't start there.
Pero no se detuvo allí.
It started because I didn't know who to talk to about my sexual urges. I didn't want to be having sex with a guy I was dating, and I didn't know what to do differently. And I think the problem is that so many Christian young adults internalize a deep shame about their sexuality because they're just told masturbation is a sin.
Well, this is the great thing that brothers and sisters in Christ, I would point to Colossians 3:5 that says that the members of our body should be dead to passion, that sexual arousal and the sexual feelings are reserved for marriage. From a clinical perspective, the secular scientist would say that masturbation for a sex addict is, reinforces the same neural pathways that porn does. And so particularly for somebody who's struggling with pornography, even the secular clinicians would say a masturbation is a relapse, so to speak, because it's inextricably connected with sexual fantasy. But Angela, I think your question was, how can somebody find freedom and victory so they can help others? I think the first step is confession. And even as Rachel mentioned earlier, the importance of authenticity about our own sin, and that encourages others to share their sin, even if it's not the same. So it's important that we walk in the light, but then also get help.
Rachel, do you want to say anything more responding to that? Also, can I just say, Ted, a practical one from the production team? Can you hold your microphone away from your zipper? It's clicking a lot as you talk there. Thanks.
Okay.
Great. Rachel,
Yeah,
Rachel.
I do agree with my brother Ted. I guess I see the journey. I'm thinking about the journey of adolescence to adulthood, and lots of our
Pause for the translation. Go ahead.
And I agree that masturbation, solo sex, is never what God designed the act of sexual intimacy for. But the fact still remains that teenagers often begin masturbating because they've woken up with an erection or because they have sexual thoughts and they don't know what to do with that. And the language of calling that sin can be very damaging to their ability to say, well, God cares about this and I can have my Christian community support me with this. It feels like you're closing down the conversation. It can lead to habitual sin where you are actively deciding to not be obedient to Jesus, but it often doesn't start there. And I think I just have a plea for us to be pastorally pragmatic and compassionate. And so I think I do agree with Ted, but I think the way I disciple young people is I wouldn't start by saying, you masturbate? Well, that's sin. I start somewhere else.
Right. That's a good point. The approach and how we're approaching this. And
Es muy
Can I
importante.
just add a little bit to the question?
Yeah.
Is there a connection? I mean, is it important to use self-discipline and also control over your thoughts? Because sometimes, it could be, Yeah, because sometimes young people could use it as an excuse. Like, it's just it's in me, it's the part of my being. So what role self-discipline and mind control plays in this whole area?
I think it's important to remember that having sexual thoughts is not the problem in itself. Adolescents are going through an enormous upheaval emotionally, physically, mentally, and often are dealing with multiple stimuli of what they're seeing. I think the point I'm trying to make, probably badly, is
it's fine. It's good.
Our job is not to stop young people thinking about sex or masturbating or having sex. That's not our job. So I think we need to have a really clear understanding of what we mean by sexual sin and to understand that somebody's journey of sexual development is very complicated. And I don't know about you, often the times that I've tasted and seen that God is good is when I've realized I've done something, I've transgressed a boundary, and I've realized, oh, that's why God says don't go there. Now, I hear the Apostle Paul's voice in my ear saying, does that mean we can just do whatever we like and don't care? No, but it does mean that we need to extend to young people the same grace that's extended to us. And I think that's my plea to the church, that if we're going to say all masturbation is a sin, we need to be able to explain why and how someone can be free from it. So I don't use the word sin at the beginning of a conversation about masturbation. I might at some point, but I need to know why I'm doing that.
So that's awesome, Rachel. Thank you. That was great. Ted, give us some practical, what are some creative ways of engaging this with a church or with a ministry or mission group? I loved what you said before. We've all got to do the program together, so it's not singling people out. Give us some practical tips.
So we created a 6-month program, Discipleship Porn Addiction Recovery Program. It's at thefreedomfight.org. And we encourage people to go through it in small groups. We have a leader's guide that walks through week by week how to lead the group. A pornography addiction is one of the most challenging to break. So having daily accountability through an app where you're staying connected is really important. But for a lot of people, 6 months seems like a long time. So we created a 30-day challenge. And this has really proven effective for one-to-one discipling or small groups. We give people hope, de-shames the topic, begins to teach them about the brain science and how to renew the mind, and introduces just the holistic approach, biblical, clinical, practical, and it encourages people to find freedom. So that 30-day challenge is something parents have done with their teenage kid, youth ministers have done with their groups, just discipling, just a lot of different options. But an easy way to introduce it is, hey, none of us are where we need to be in holiness. Hey, let's do this 30-day challenge together.
Rachel, did you want to add anything like in terms of creative ways you found that are cool in terms of getting young people in the churches to engage in the conversation, in the topic? Any practical tips, like how to get started? I'm in a church, I'm a church leader. How do I get started talking about this stuff?
So I believe that there's power in the mention, which means say stuff, name it from your platforms, keep talking about the things that you believe Jesus is passionately interested in. So like Ted has said, don't say, oh, we've got to talk about sex because it's awful. There's so much sex out there. I mean, this is God's amazing gift of sex. Society has no idea what they're missing when they don't understand a Christian sexual ethic. And Raphael, you're an absolute legend, by the way. That translation's awesome.
Yeah.
And the last comment is, if we are preaching or teaching or sharing our story, we don't just share the stories of our sex. So even though now I am married to Jason, we have 2 adopted children, I'm not being sexually unfaithful, I'm not having an adulterous relationship with anybody else, even though that's my truth, I still need Jesus to help me be holy in my sexual thought life, in my interaction with my husband, in how I dress, how I engage. And that, I think, is most helpful to the young women that I disciple, that they hear how I'm putting Jesus at the center of my sexuality today.
Wow, this has been so cool, guys. It's been so awesome. You guys have mentioned some practical things, and Ted, specifically, you've got a tool that people can access through your website. So yeah, the production team is sharing a link there on the chat now. It's steiger.org sexuality resources. And on that, I mean, the team's done a great job, and they've put there like all the books that have been mentioned yesterday and today, and the Freedom Fight link as well, and different things there that you can use. There are some other things there, like a few other websites that also often tools to help with this, like with pornography and different things. Rachel, Ted, it has been so cool to hear from you both. Guys, Rachel Gardner from the UK has a book called The Sex Thing. There is a link in the chat so you can find her book. I got to take part in a really cool podcast she hosts as well earlier this year with Youthscape, which is a youth ministry in the UK. And you also work with the Girls Brigade in the UK. Is that right?
Yeah, and my husband and I, we've planted a church on a housing estate in the north of England, reaching young people in a really poor community. So all this stuff is so relevant for us as well. Yeah.
And we're starting some actions with Steiger in the UK over the past couple of years, so we need to stay in touch. Ted, thank you so much for joining us. Guys, you can check out Ted's book, The Freedom Fight, also on Amazon. The team's put the link there in the chat as well. So thank you. Ted, is there anything else you wanted to share with us before we let you guys go?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Well, we'll let Rachel and Ted go. And I want to share a couple of practical things with you all before we go to small group time. Like I said, yesterday, the small groups were amazing. We had like all different languages, and people stayed for a long time talking more about the topic. So first of all, there is again that link for the resources from this event. If you want to keep hearing my wonderful voice, you guys can listen to our podcast. David, Ben, Chad, and I have a podcast called Provoke and Inspire, and we talk about the topics related to what we do as a mission and how to be radical for Jesus in this secular age. So we have really enjoyed spending this time with you guys, and we want you to stay engaged, stay connected with us. Yeah, so guys, thank you so much for taking part in this online event with us. What did you think, Angela?
I think it was such a great time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I plan on re-listening to our recordings. I want to make some notes because this information from yesterday and from today is like priceless. And I really want to encourage you, whoever listens to me right now, to think how you can not only apply it to yourself, but how can you help to bring this awareness to your church, to your group, to your organization or mission, maybe to your friends and to your family. You know, we all need it. So it was amazing. And Luke, am I right? We're gonna do something else in the future, right? This is not the last one.
Oh yeah, for sure. We want to do loads more of these.
Address the hardest issues and the hardest questions, right?
Yeah, and you guys can write to us and say, hey, can you do an online event about this or about that? Yeah. And we want to be really engaging with the topics that matter right now.
I'm just reminded of the verse from the Bible that when the light comes, darkness flees. So I think the more we do such events, and maybe you who listen to us, you want to do something like this for your language group, for example. Yeah, then the more light will come and darkness will flee.
Yeah,
Amen.
I agree. This one today was important because it affects all of us, right? It's an important topic for reaching global youth culture, but it's a topic that really affects us in the church, in missions, in everything. So I hope that what was shared today has also been helpful for you, that it's encouraged you, it's challenged you, as Rachel was saying, to be closer to Jesus. And maybe we could just pray here at the end, Angela, just pray for people, especially if there's a particular topic we talked about that is an issue for you. I'd like to pray that God could bring freedom in your life. So I'll pray. You could pray too if you want, Angela, after me. Jesus, thank you so much for the freedom that you give us. Thank you for your power and for your grace over our lives. Thank you for Ted and for Rachel and the things that they spoke into our lives today. I just pray that if there's anybody here on the call today who's been struggling in the area of pornography, I pray if there's anybody who's been confused or struggling with anything related to sexuality and relationships, I pray for freedom and healing in your name, Jesus. I pray you would put a deep fire and passion in our hearts for you so that we will flee from evil and we'll run to you, and that we would be instruments in your hands, that we could be missionaries to this generation because we're strong in you.
Yes, Jesus. I want to thank you, Lord, that you bring no shame. And when we get to your presence, we feel completely accepted. And I am so blessed by this line during yesterday and today, the line that speaks about your amazing love to us. And there is no fear in love. So I just pray for this progressive revelation for every one of us on this call, that we would be so in love with you, and then all the fear and shame will go, that we wouldn't need to substitute you with anything else. I just pray for this call to the intimacy. I know you're calling all of us to deeper intimacy with you. When we're close to you, we are so powerful, and there is nothing impossible for us. We will be able to preach your gospel and get our generation filled with light. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right, guys, our time is up. Thank you, production team, for an amazing job that you guys did for this for these 2 days. Have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Thanks for joining this event, and see you next time.